Thank you very much, Gary, for the introduction. I'm Ben Burggraaf. I'm the Chief Executive for Net Zero Industry Wales. And I'm here to talk about what role circularity plays in achieving net zero. And we already heard some excellent examples earlier this morning of what role it can play. But I want to think a bit wider than that. And I only took up the role, in October last year, before actually working for Welsh Water and also Tata Steel, where I started working in the South Wales in 2006. I've been involved in about £200 million worth of investment in the energy and decarbonisation efforts in South Wales over the last 17 years that I've been living here. So I really want to bring some of that experience into the wider green industrial revolution. So what is Net Zero Industry Wales? We're actually a not-for-profit umbrella organisation that supports the Welsh industrial clusters. First of all, the South Wales industrial cluster, but we will be becoming a pan-Wales kind of organisation, and its partners on their journey to net zero. We are not Welsh government, Gary. We actually are a membership organisation, but really well supported by Welsh government. And I'm reporting to an industry-led board of which the big emitters currently sit. And all the big emitters in South Wales have a seat at the table. What we want to really make happen is we want to make Wales the country of choice for sustainable goods and services. And hopefully that will sound well with all people involved here. And circularity plays a big role in there. By supporting that trusted, sustainable, prosperous and resilient Welsh industry, that leads the transition to a healthier and equal and cohesive Wales, resulting in an industry that citizens of Wales are proud of and globally responsible and built, and I think that's really important, on its very strong industrial heritage and not being embarrassed of it, but actually really taking that by the bull by the horns and really taking that forward. Now, what I'm here to do is actually work on 3 different fronts. First of all, I want to really capitalize on that buzz that's happening in this room, but also the buzz that has been shaped within the South Wales Industrial Cluster, developing the cluster plan, and really starting to develop that culture further forward. And trust is absolutely pivotal. So as an organization, as our members, we all need to be having a clear purpose, clearly aligned with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. We need to show that we have the ability to deliver what we say we want to do, be dependable. We also need to feedback on what we're achieving, and so ensure that we remain on target, but we also need to be transparent, have an integrity. So all of that is a really important piece of the trust component. We also need to take a Team Wales approach, really coalescing, working together within the small but very active community we have in Wales. And I often say, if we can't make it happen in Wales, where else can we make it happen? Because almost everybody in Wales knows each other or is involved in some way or another. And it needs to be opportunity-led. We shouldn't be seeing net zero as a threat to our businesses. We really should see it as an opportunity to really transform the way we do business and the way we actually thrive in our society. Secondly, I think it's really important that I work together with the economic and also with the climate change teams within Welsh Government and also beyond to actually shape that economic and climate change marriage. Because we need to work in coalescence with each other to make that a reality. But also the regulatory bodies involved in the licensing and the permitting and planning permission stages also need to be properly resourced to actually make that a reality. And also what's important is we make sure that this cross-party support. So it's a long-term journey we're on, so we can't be on the whims of any political changes. We need to make sure that everybody's on board across all parties that this is the right way forward. And last but not least, what we need for the recipe of success, we need an attractive environment for companies to invest in. So that means a resilient and high quality infrastructure, and that is not only electrical, it's gas, it's port, it's CO2 shipping, all of that needs to be attractive for businesses to invest in. Now, the South Wales Industrial Cluster tries to encompass that. So South Wales Industrial Cluster actually published a plan, I think, early this year, and a lot of you actually attended that launch. And that outlines a very ambitious 60 million tonne reduction plan by 2040, but it costs £30 billion to achieve. And the plan relies heavily on fuel switching, hydrogen electrification, and the deployment of CCUS, carbon capture utilization technology, to make that reality. You can see that on the pie chart here. Fuel switching, 47% of the savings there, and 33% there associated with carbon capture and storage. But it also outlines a really clear message here. If we continue what we're doing now, we establish degrowth, in other words, less economic and industrial output, and actually giving a slower rate of return, in comparison if we take a more progressive approach of actually taking action now and accelerating the decarbonization with the appropriate support. Now, when we look about the role of circular thinking, it's actually embedded in all the 5 cogs outlined, whether it's energy, resource efficiency, when we talk about fuel switching, the clean growth hubs, carbon capture utilization, and or the carbon capture and storage kind of elements. But more important, I want to bring out 2 key elements here, and this is really about the clean growth hubs. And those clean growth hubs is actually aims to discover connections between the different companies and really forces companies to think about how they can work and share resources. And these are not only material waste, but also energy waste. Industrial waste heat being used to actually heat buildings. But we need to also stick away from the word waste, in my view, because waste is a raw material. Yeah? Any raw material that's been mined up never can be used immediately again. It needs some form of processing. This is the same thing with any waste material that comes out of a process. So we really need to think about how we can use that. So I'm not really in favor of using waste in circular economy. I'm facing it as a new way of actually saying it's a raw material. But also this thinking needs to go beyond liquid and solid waste. We also need to think about gas, CO2 for example, but also heat in this kind of context. And then 4, we talk about carbon utilization and storage. This is actually using CO2 to make carbon products, using another energy source, for example, hydrogen, and preferably green hydrogen, to make sustainable aviation fuels, to make food protein, to actually make acetate, a platform chemical for the chemical industries, actually make on running shoes or Zara clothing. It can go beyond that. Yeah? And that is a really important component, again, of the South Wales Industrial Cluster Plan. Now, you think, is that all pie in the sky? It is actually not pie in the sky, because things are actually in motion. So you've got LanzaTech, developing their sustainable aviation plan in Port Talbot, and they're working towards doing the front-end engineering design to get it into financial close. They got really good government support from the Department of Transport for that, to work towards creating a significant amount of sustainable aviation fuel, which basically replaces 1% of the total aviation kerosene. There's a significant plant there. The other thing that's happening here, you see on the right-hand side, in the RISE program, is actually some real demonstrations. In Valais, using algae from waste CO2, producing the algae then to make very high chemicals, used in the pharmaceutical industry, but also into cosmetics and other kind of areas. And then also there's a project ongoing in Tata where they're using CoAce. There's a process of mixing waste CO2 streams with hydrogen and again creating platform chemicals. So these are things are happening at demonstration scale, but they're becoming a reality. And also I think it's really good, and I'm really impressed by this strapline. I only recently learned this itself. I know Owen is in the room here. Yeah? But this is exactly what we need to do, isn't it? Give infinite lives to finite resources. That is what circularity is all about. And should not be all about waste. It should be in all what we consume. So I think it's really well captured. So you see even companies now pivoting to that kind of strapline. Cells is a really good example of that. So that's happening already in the cluster. Isn't that exciting? So for me, I think, and I really want to, we'll have a bit of time for some discussion again in this particular area, some questions. But for me, it's very important to say that energy and resource efficient plays a very significant role in delivering net zero. And this was already mentioned a couple of times actually within this thing. But it should go beyond the waste silo. Yeah? It should cut across everything we do. There is a need for more holistic thinking beyond the kind of liquid and solid waste as earlier, and really think about integrating heat, industrial waste heat, yeah, into that system, but also gas. For example, using waste CO2 to make food-grade CO2 to actually go into food and drinks, for example. Yeah? Sounds a bit strange and disgusting, but it is possible. And there are already projects ongoing to transform, for example, human waste sources, CO2-derived one, and bring that back into the food cycle. In the same way that there are projects ongoing in other parts of the world where they're reusing wastewater effluent to make drinking water. We really have to think about these kind of things, particularly in a response to climate change and when we adapt to climate change going forward. There's a really need to create incentives and formally recognize organizations that increase circularity and don't see them just as waste operators, as operators that treat waste. And so when we talk about a very specific example, when we are dealing with sharing industrial waste heat, there's currently no formal recognition for a producer of industrial waste heat to actually claim the carbon credit associated with actually heating that a building alongside of their boundary and offsetting other forms of fossil fuel use. It's already been deemed as net zero by all kinds of policy, but there's nothing there in place to recognize those companies formally for that. And hence there is no real kind of incentive. And there are a couple of other places where that is the same case. And when it's about CO2, for example, waste CO2 being used in the food grade sector, but also I think across some of the liquid and solid waste. So we really need to think about how we incentivize and certify these changeovers and actually hand over the carbon credit or the other sustainability benefit that sits with actually in circularity. We really need to think about that. And last but not least, I think I really want to thank you for all your efforts here today and all congregating here together to talk about this very important kind of policy that sits, I think, within the net zero agenda. But please be also vocal. Go back to your organization and think about how you can also bring it across your organizations rather than still sit within the waste silo. Because I hear the words circularity and waste too often together, and I think we need to really broaden that out to a much wider, parts of the organization. Like net zero, it sits across every silo of the organization. Circularity sits alongside of that, or actually on top of that, depending on how you look at it. So thank you very much for your time and listening to my soapbox speak. And I'm really curious to hear, some of your questions and further builds on what we're discussing today. Thank you very much.
We do have a roving mic somewhere, so any questions? Phil?
I really, really good presentation. But to take Tony Burnett's view, which always says thumbs up, okay? If we're going to move away from the blah, blah, blah and actually get something done, there's a lot of very difficult conversations that we need to have with industry and manufacturers, okay? So between the NHS and construction, that contributes a third of the commodity, let's not call it waste, that's created, okay? But we really need to think the way that people design and think about what they're doing, particularly in engineering and construction. I had a chat with a colleague here called Chris, okay? Unless you can get the big manufacturers and construction industry to change the way that they're building built environments, which is one way that we can enact and affect this, okay? We're not going to get anywhere because builders are building exactly the same way that they've been building for 200 years and not changing their thinking about it. And we already know that we can create net negative communities from the way that we federate energy innovation, air quality, and building and construction into communities. So unless we can change that dynamic, we're not going to get anywhere really quickly.
I cannot agree more. And I think what we need to think about is that we need to step away, and it links into some of the comments I made to Dario. I think we need to really think about how we can co-create in a trusted environment, those kind of things. So we need to think about the sticks as well as the carrots. And I think what is really happening a lot, in my view, is the polarized discussion. So either against or in favor. And there's nothing in between. I think we need to come together. I come from I'm Dutch, yeah? And we used to polderen, yeah? The art of compromise. And I think we need to really take a more pragmatic approach where we actually start to come together, find common grounds, because my experience in net zero over all those 17 years plus implementing is that actually the cost of not doing things is significantly higher than actually the cost of actually doing the upfront bit. And people are always referring to the cost of decarbonization as the baseline cost now, yeah, and reflecting that back because it's more expensive than it used to be. Absolutely tick box. But what we need to think about is about what the do-nothing costs are. And those are very difficult to quantify. But my experience has been implementing renewables, energy efficiency projects that the paybacks tend to be significantly quicker than they used to be because the cost of energy rises significantly quicker than people ever forecasted it to be. And secondly, I think the kind of adaptation kind of cost, which we're all going to face if we're not dealing with this, is another component. So I think we need to step away from this cost element. We need to think about value, links again to the Green Book argument that was made earlier. But I think what is important for people to gather, whether small businesses or big businesses, the cost of not taking any actions is significantly more expensive than actually the cost of taking adequate action now. And I think that hopefully is enough common ground to actually bring people together, and we need then to create that common ground where people can start to move in this journey in small but pragmatic and also meaningful steps. Yeah? That's where we want to play a role as Net Zero Industry Wales. We're not here a lobby group. We're here to help with the implementation of the actual delivery of the plans. Owen?
Owen Bailey from Salsa Steel. I like the point 3 you've got on the screen behind you about incentives. I think the problem we have between linear and circular is that linear and decarbonisation within a linear economy is only ever quantifying the negative impacts, the impacts of industries in terms of scope 1, the impacts of energy in scope 2, and then the very vague scope 3 between everything else. The problem we have is that when we quantify that impact and we do a life cycle assessment on a building, for example, we break it into 4 modules, A, B, C, and D. And A is the design stage, and I'm paraphrasing here. A is design, B is build, C is use, and then D is end of life. What we need to be doing is bookending a life cycle assessment with D on both ends, so we can actually assess the value of the resources we have around us and incentivize construction or anyone else to utilize resources we already have, design those resources back into the development of new developments, and then start the process again. But we don't have that, and we have this tug of war, this competition between the linear and the circular. And we need to be pushing more towards quantifying value as opposed to just quantifying impact. And perhaps that's something that Derek and the team at the Commission could consider, on how we in Wales highlight those value aspects and incentivise organisations at all levels, across all supply chains, to utilise resources more effectively.
I agree, Owen. I think there is some of that happening as we speak. So what I find very interesting is the whole kind of debate around lithium, for example. So you see, for example, when you buy a Ford electric car, actually Ford retains the ownership of the battery and the actual lithium that sits within, because they see it as a really precious metal or precious kind of commodity they want to keep and retain. So once bought, it's theirs because they want to make sure it keeps on going around. And I think there is, a need for businesses to think about it in a similar way. Once they bought iron ore, or bought adequate copper, or bought adequate platinum or gold or whatever, what is your process to bring that back rather than think about mining new stuff all the time? Because I find it insane that once you bought it, how do you can actually bring that back in your whole thing? Because generally speaking, there's a lot of upfront cost associated with bringing it in, not only from a financial cost, but also from a human cost. There are some modern slavery aspects associated with some of those very precious metals. And we really need to start thinking about those kind of things. And there is a bit of movement in that space, but is it going quick enough? And that's why I'm really keen that we find incentives for companies to actually showcase some of these kind of things, where they do things properly, but also being incentivized, financially for that as well. Or being given a stamp of approval or a trademark for people to do the right thing and buy that, and it's been clearly identified. And that is not always seen. And the packaging you sometimes get in supermarkets is very difficult to gauge what is recyclable, what's not. Everybody has these different logos, for example. There's a lot of confusion around that. So I think the incentives are key to help drive some of that. So the whole kind of thing between stick and carrots and co-creating those kind of things at the same time, I think is a very important thing. But there is a bit of movement in that space, particularly around those very precious adequate metals like lithium, for example.
Thanks very much, Ben. Just want to be conscious of those online. So our colleague Andrew's online. Any questions come through in the chat there, Andrew?
Hi, Gary. Just checking that you could hear me okay.
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Just a few things really, which were quite interesting in terms of the themes that are coming out across the two main speakers. One of the things that occurred to me over the last couple of minutes was how we can incentivize. That seems to be the big theme. And what was rather interesting, I thought, was one of our previous contributors talked about things like the five-stage business case that we've been using for donkey's years, and maybe that's a fantastic way that we can adapt that in order to incentivize new and emerging business projects to be evaluated in a way that takes into account sustainability and circularity. I thought that was a really good point. In addition, I think Tony Mizan from Academy Wales was talking about the disconnect between the aspirations that we all have in Wales and the practical deployment, and that really, I think, is the challenge. One further point that seems to be coming out in discussion, if you look at the public sector in Wales, let's look at the NHS, for example. Carbon footprint, procurement 60%, transport 17%, buildings 23%. Procurement is what the public sector in Wales, Welsh Government can do to incentivise public sector to procure in a way that helps us achieve these ambitions. So some general points that have come out of discussion online. So I don't know whether Ben has any sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, Andy, I think I want to piggyback on the last comment around procurement. What I see a lot and what's coming out of ONS service quite a bit is that a lot of these smaller, medium-sized businesses not even think about actually developing their own sustainability plan, let alone net zero plan, because they don't see it as a priority. And I think I'm really afraid of what currently is happening, because the bigger organizations, NHS is one of them, but I used to work in Welsh Water, they are starting to develop their own sustainable procurement processes, and they're starting in the pre-qualification questionnaire saying, okay, you want to tender for this contract, what is your current carbon footprint or your current carbon intensity for every good and services you provide? And secondly, what is your net zero plan? In the same way, they tend to ask, what is your health and safety performance and what is your plan to reduce it? A very similar analogy here. But what's happening is that they are not actually switched on to this kind of request. They are not aware of it, but also they will be very flustered once this comes up for tender, that they don't have an answer to this. And if you look at the surveys currently, and this is a big concern for me, is that a lot of those small and medium-sized businesses in Wales, and it's the same pretty much across the UK, they're actually not ready to respond to that question. And as a result of it, they will probably likely lose out to the ones that are, but likely be bigger companies that are already on this journey. And I think what is for me key is that we actually start having conversations with small and medium-sized enterprises, making them aware of this threat to their top line, because they're really focused around energy costs and their bottom line. But for me, what is a bigger concern is that not actually physically getting the sales going forward. So they're losing their business if they're not actually ready for it. And I had some conversations in recent weeks and months with really big construction firms who tailor for Hinkley Point and others. They even started yet. So we really need to drum home on that kind of need for them to start thinking about what is their plan to reduce emissions, improve their sustainability, and what is their current performance, because that's what companies are going to ask for, the NHS, the local authorities as well, and other big organizations. And I think we really need to all play a part in helping send that message across to those medium-sized businesses, because it's important. But more importantly, help them, because I think we need to give them a couple of nuggets of our knowledge, and a bit of our time to actually start shaping their plans and their thinking around this. Because just being focused on the here and now and actually focused on the high energy costs, I know it's survival, but I think that short-termism really puts our long-term business at risk. So I think it's really important that we realize that and also consider that when we're drafting our own sustainable procurement plan, that we still want to pull in those small businesses local in Wales to retain as much of the value here. Again, aligned with the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, so that we're not doing the wrong thing by doing it too quickly and actually hurting another aspect of the well-being and sustainability goals.
Thank you, Ben. We've got time for one more, but I'd very much applaud your suggestion of ensuring the foundational economy and the circular economy in Wales do work together, yes, so that we do engage SMEs and suppliers, refurbishers, remanufacturers in Wales. Do we have another question?
Is on? Oh, thank you. Sorry. Andy from Arab. Really interesting talk. Really a lot of thought-provoking points there. I'm not in the industry per se. We're in sort of built environment infrastructure, but a lot of our barriers to circular economy and net zero is the liability of having other materials from other, that would be traditionally counted as waste, and how we incorporate that risk into our sort of designs and our developments that we're working on. I wonder if you'd come across that in your work and how you've potentially overcome that.
No, I'm not sure whether I can answer your answer fully, because I'm not too familiar with that built environment myself, being from an industrial background. But I think it's also important in the circularity stories where stuff comes from. So the raw materials that you build houses or buildings for, if that can be sourced and manufactured in Wales, So what I see a lot in the discussions with developers saying a Tata or a Hansen or a Celsa, or they can't make the material which I want, So hence I'm going to source it from Germany. What I would encourage developers, and particularly your customers, to think about is saying, do you know what? We have these materials in Wales. Can we build the type of building with the materials we have in Wales? And we don't have those conversations. And they're like, ooh, that's a light bulb moment. Because it could be a wood-engineered product. It could be a rebar solution from Celsa. It could be a strip material from Tata, or an insulation material from Rockwool. I think if we would think about what kind of materials and raw materials we have actually on our doorstep, and think about what we want, because that's how we would build anything when we were centuries ago. We wouldn't go and travel with a horse and cart for hundreds of miles by ship and to get stuff to build a house. We would look around in our neighborhoods, isn't it, about what's available. I think we need to go back to that practice, because for me, I think you get more control over the quality, more control of how much you consume, and actually you reduce the amount of miles that is traveled. And what I find bonkers, I grew up in a town called Drachten, in Friesland. And they create prefab concrete structures there. And I was standing on a Welsh water site. And you know what came by? Kylstra, the manufacturer, delivered a prefab construction from my hometown in Drachten to put a sewage pipe in somewhere in Wales. I find that remarkable. So those things we need to really stop doing. We need to really think about what's available, have conversations with the manufacturers around that, and then design your building, not the other way around, because that is true sustainable thinking in my view. Hopefully that answered partly your question. Okay. Any questions from women? Going back on, have I put you off? No? Okay.
I think we've just run out of time,
Okay,
but thank you very much, Ben. We do need to change the mindset. We do need to change the paradigm. So a huge thanks to Ben. Thank you.
Okay.